I'm Edward Haynes, and I'll read the prologue to my book called The Sounds of Africa, Confronting the Beginning of AIDS and the End of Apartheid. In the prologue, you'll hear two major references to sounds, and in the book, there are numerous references of sounds. Peter and I enjoyed a trip to Kruger Park, a vast animal reserve as large as New Jersey, as large as Israel. Leaving Johannesburg in the morning, we drove east on expressways most of the day and turned onto two-lane highways toward the park. As we drove across the countryside, I saw few blacks. Apparently, the government's laws of apartheid had succeeded to a great degree in separating the races. Far in the distance, I saw some mud brick houses, their front walls decorated with geometric designs and whitewash. No signs of life were there, human or otherwise. They seemed deserted on the barren, treeless land. At last, I saw a woman sitting outside one house and children playing in the dirt. Older boys were playing soccer with a tin can. I was disturbed by the sight and almost distracted from driving. When we approached Skukuza Gate to enter the park, we were eager to reach our campsite before the evening curfew, which is imposed to protect animals and automobiles. My few days in South Africa seemed to confirm the idea I had received from some foreign source that night falls quickly over Africa, meaning, I suppose, twilight is shorter there. Now, in the open countryside, I would truly experience it. I was thrilled to be in Africa, especially being there with Peter, and I wanted to experience all of it. Peter asked why I turned off the car radio as we entered the park. I answered, because I want to hear the sounds of Africa. Peter laughed. Listen, he said, do you hear that bird? The faint sound of a small bird joined the sound of our motor. But I heard no cry from an exotic African bird. To hear the sounds of Africa was one of my pronouncements he always remembered, and he often used it in his funny stories about me in Africa. Peter had grown up there. He didn't have my romantic ideas of Africa, which had prompted me to listen for a Tarzan soundtrack from Hollywood. My holiday with Peter early in 1980 was our longest time together after our meeting in New York 6 months earlier. Our first meeting had been electric, our response to each other spontaneous and complete. The connection between us had seemed so right that we assumed we were meant to be together, although we lived 10,000 miles apart. Peter worked for South African Airways, and after we had met, he flew to New York as often as possible, every 2 or 3 weeks. In December, he had been promoted to chief steward on domestic flights. He was no longer flying to New York, so I'd planned a trip to visit him. Our 3 days and nights in the park were idyllic, in a camp on a high ridge near the Mozambique border, with hippos lounging in the river below. We drove through the central area of the reserve during the day, photographing animals grazing in the distance or standing to our delight near the road. Only the narrow asphalt road intruded upon the vast wild space. We saw giraffes and elephants grazing at trees. A mother hyena and her young paraded across the road ahead. I'd never seen such strange trees or giant anthills. Back at the camp, we ate dinner under trees and stars. We decided to drive back to Johannesburg through the foothills of the Drakensberg, the Dragon Mountains. It was a longer route on 2-lane roads skirting the mountain range that separates Johannesburg in the high central plateau from the tropical coastal plain leading to the Indian Ocean. We coasted up and down hills on the empty road as if we were flying across a magical landscape. I drove as if on autopilot, easily along the road we could see rising and disappearing again and again. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through drifting clouds intensified the shades of green with an eerie glow. No other automobiles, no animals or birds could be heard. The only sound was the hum of our car. Peter sat close to me, and it seemed I was no longer in an automobile. I was free in an exotic place with someone I loved, a strange landscape flying past, as we flew up and down the hills. As we floated over the crest of a hill, I saw 3 figures, black boys, run from the road into the bush, and at the same time, I saw a sharp spike on the road directly in the path of our car. I could not avoid it, and I heard the crunch as it punctured a tire. Slowly, I pressed the brake and prayed the tire would not explode and send us into a spin. The spike held fast, so the air escaped slowly, and we reached a service station before the tire was flat. With great relief, we pulled into the station that had saved us from stopping on the open road. The gas station was empty except for an elderly black man sitting in a car near the door. He helped me change the tire and accepted my money and thanks without expression or comment. Peter and I stood for a while, recovering from the frightening experience of possibly being attacked and robbed. The sun was down, and everything was still, profoundly silent. Then daylight was gone, and quickly night fell. Soberly and quietly, we continued the drive to Johannesburg. We were in bed before daybreak. South Africa was a pariah among nations in 1980, but with gold at an all-time high, its economy was flourishing. Visiting the country was not a political or ethical dilemma for me. I knew I loved Peter, and I knew his opinion of his country, which made me sad. It was hard for me to imagine being ashamed of my country even after Vietnam. However, his government's policy of separating the races, apartheid, was much deeper and harder than Vietnam. I had seen evidence of it in the city soon after I arrived. After my visit, Peter managed to arrange flights to New York, and I returned to South Africa the following year for 2 months. The second visit resulted in contracts for work, and I continued to work there for 10 years. Our life together was good until Peter became ill. Eventually, he became too weak to walk, and we knew he was seriously ill. We had watched the country slowly change during the 80s, from full apartheid to an uncertain state of flux, as one apartheid law after another was challenged and repealed. But our lives were centered on ourselves and on Peter's illness. When he was not in the hospital or in doctors' offices, Peter spent the days on our living room sofa. I moved Peter to the bedroom one evening shortly before Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990. Our bedroom was dark, except for some faint reflected light from other buildings coming in through the windows that were open to catch a breeze from the summer night. We heard gunfire in the street below. We knew South Africa was coming apart. People seemed paralyzed by an anxiety about the future, and crime and violence were increasing rapidly. On the 12th floor, the narrow street beside our apartment building made the sounds sound closer. We heard the sounds of men shouting in the streets below and people running. Shots from one end of the street were followed by shouts, and then more shots from the other end of the street. More shouts and more shots. And Peter whispered, "Do you hear the sounds of Africa?"